Okay, greetings everyone. What I will be doing now is the second half of my introductory lecture on Plato. Um, Previously, I'd gotten up to the allegory of the cave, and that's where I want to pick things up today. The allegory is supposed to be an imaginative, metaphorical way of presenting Plato's view of metaphysics, the metaphysics of our reality, but then also of his epistemology as well. Okay, so without further ado, let me share my screen. Is this what I want? Yes, I think so. Here we are. So this is Plato's Allegory of the Cave. Page down. So Plato realizes that most human beings are never really aware of this realm of forms that we've been talking about, and its relationship to the visible world, which we see. Regrettably, according to Plato, they are deceived and they take appearances for reality. So you'll recall I mentioned earlier that this is a running theme throughout Platonic philosophy, is the distinction between appearance and reality. And what he's saying is we're taking the appearances of the visible world for reality when in fact they are not the fundamental realities of our of the world, the cosmos. Most people believe the things they see before them are what is real, when in fact they are merely imperfect reflections of what is really real, according to Plato. He illustrates this with his famous allegory of the cave. This is from a work of his called The Republic. The main character, of course, is Socrates, and Socrates begins by saying, "Let me show you in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open towards the light and reaching all along the den. Here they have been from their childhood, and they have their legs and necks chained, so they cannot move, and can only see what is before them, being prevented by the chains from turning round their heads. Above and behind them is a fire blazing at a distance, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way. And you will see, if you look, a low wall built along the way, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets." Glaucon, interlocutor for Socrates, says, "I see." "And do you see?" I said. "Men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of vessels and statues and figures of animals made of wood and stone and various materials, which appear over the wall, some of them talking, others silent." "You have shown me a strange image," Glaucon says, "and they are strange prisoners." "Like ourselves," I replied, "and they see only their own shadows and the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave." "True," Glaucon says. "How could they see anything but the shadows if they're never allowed to move their heads?" All right, so what is going on here? Well, you have these prisoners that look strangely like Muppets, I see. Anyway, these prisoners are held fast, and they can't move around, and they're in the bottom of this cave. Right? And since their childhood, this is where they've been, and all they've had to look at is this wall, because they can't move around. Now, behind the prisoners, there is a stone wall. Behind the stone wall, there are individuals who happen to be carrying things like, I don't know why they have a chair there, but okay, statues of animals and whatnot, vases, whatnot. Behind them, there is a blazing fire. So the fire is shining light on these things and thereby casting shadows on the wall. Of course, that's all these individuals are seeing, is the shadows being cast on the wall. Now, up and outside is the world that we know, right? Outside the cave. But they're completely ignorant of any of that because they're down here, and all they ever see is the wall and the shadows. Okay, so that's the metaphor of the cave. Here's another illustration of largely the same idea. Here are our prisoners. Here are the shadows. Once again, a chair, which I should think is odd. Okay, fine. But there's a little cat shadow, right? Because it's holding a statue of a cat, chair, whatnot. There's the fire blazing. Now, Socrates asks us to imagine what would happen if one of these prisoners were loosed and turned to look at the fire directly. So imagine one of those individuals who since their childhood have only been looking at a wall with shadows being cast upon it. And now for the first time, he's able to look at the light, the burning fire that's behind him. Quoting from Plato's Republic. And if he is compelled to look straight at the light, will he not have a pain in his eyes, which will make him turn away to take in the objects of vision which he can see, and which he will conceive to be reality clearer than the things which are now being shown to him? True, Glaucon said. So in other words, if you were to turn around and look, and you're looking now at the wall, and you're looking at these people in this blazing light, you'd want to go back to the shadows, because those you understood, those were familiar, those were clear to you, when this other stuff is just dazzling and painful. And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up the steep and rugged ascent, and held fast until he is forced into the presence of the sun himself. Is he not likely to be pained and irritated? When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what we now call realities. He will require to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. And first he will see the shadows best, next the reflections of men and other objects in water, and then the objects themselves. Then he will gaze upon the light of the moon and the stars and the spangled heavens, and he will see the sky and the stars by night better than the sun or the light of the sun by day. Last, he will be able to see the sun, and not mere reflections of him in water, but he will see him in his own proper place and not in another, and he will contemplate him as he is, the sun, personifying the sun at the moment. So notice this part of the allegory, right? If that prisoner is taken up and forced into the sunlight, he's going to be totally disoriented, right? It's going to be a painful, baffling, bewildering affair. And it'll take a long time for him to slowly become accustomed to the light of the day. And it'll be a long time before he's actually able to see the sun itself. So here's another illustration. Again, we have the prisoners, we have the shadows, we have people carrying objects that are casting the shadows, blazing fire. Here are the prisoners who look strangely Aryan, don't they? In any event, but notice this image gets it wrong a little bit, right? Do you see what's sort of wrong? I mean, aside from the Aryan Greeks, do you see what's wrong with the with this illustration, right? They all seem to be happy. And what Plato is saying is, no, 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 no. They're not going to be happy about this. This is going to be, it's not this immediately liberating experience. It's actually a painful growth experience. Now, Socrates asks us to imagine what would happen if one of these freed, enlightened prisoners were to return to the cave and tell his former prisoners, fellow prisoners, of his adventures. And of the true nature of reality and the distinction between reality and the mere appearances of reality. So imagine this guy gets up to the, or gal, this person, gets up to the upper world, grows accustomed, realizes what's been going on. Hey, I've been chained in a cave and so have all my friends. And I've been looking at shadows and imagining the shadows to be real things, when they're nothing but shadows cast by objects which themselves were imitations of the real stuff. I'm looking at the real stuff now. I got to let them know. Right? So he goes on this sort of rescue mission down into the cave and tries to free the former, the prisoners. Again, quoting from Plato now. And if there were a contest and he had to compete in measuring the shadows with the prisoners who had never moved out of the den, while his sight was still weak and before his eyes had become steady, and the time which would be needed to acquire this new habit of sight might be very considerable, would he not be ridiculous? In other words, if you had now uh, grown accustomed to the light of the upper world, and then you return to this dark, dank cave, and you're trying to look at the shadows, you're not going to be able to see them very clearly. Those prisoners that never left, they're going to be able to see them much better. And they're going to have a much easier time identifying what shadows are being projected on the wall. They're going to be able to identify them. They never left. So their eyes are still seeing things that way. You aren't. And you're going to look foolish to them because you can't do what they can do. You can't see the shadows the way they can. Men would say of him that up he went and down he came without his eyes, and that it was better not to even think of ascending. And if anyone tried to loose another and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death. So a couple of things. Number one, what is they saying there? He would look so ridiculous that no one wants to repeat that. Right? Whatever happened to this fellow, they think this fellow has lost his ability to understand or think. He's a ridiculous individual. And I don't want that to happen to me. I'm staying right here in this cave. I'm just staying put. I don't want that to happen to me. What happened to this guy, right? And don't you try to make me do that. And they notice that last line, right? If they did, they would catch the offender and they would try to put him to death. Who's that a reference to? Well, hopefully you see that's a reference to Plato's teacher, Socrates. In Plato's mind, he's thinking Socrates is one who had glimpsed the realities of things. Socrates is one who was not willing to accept appearance for reality. And he tried to prevent his fellow prisoners from taking appearance for reality. And what happened to Socrates? Well, he was so annoying and so threatening that they ended up executing him. Interesting, right? For the children of this world are more prudent in dealing with their own generation than the children of light. Reference from Luke, right? But the same sort of idea, right? If you're just used to your familiar surroundings. So I thought this was sort of interesting. In other words, taking appearance for reality and sometimes maybe mistaking that. Right? Or, that's also, I thought, rather interesting. Did somehow Plato anticipate cinema, right? Where we all sit in dark caves and we look at shadows being projected on a wall and we take it for reality? I remember when many years ago now, I don't know how long it is, was it 25 years? Anyway, many years ago when the movie Titanic came out, I had students who would come up to me and say, "Oh, professor, have you seen the movie Titanic?" I said, "No, I haven't." "Oh, you should see it. It's such a good movie. I cried and I cried and I cried." Yeah, that sounds like a good time, doesn't it? But I'm thinking, Leonardo DiCaprio is doing fine. So you really didn't have to cry for him. Did you realize there was a real Titanic? There were real people who really died? Anyway. So a couple of years ago, a colleague of mine encouraged her introduction to philosophy students to find creative ways of illustrating course material. And one of her students created this. I don't know if you can see what's going on here, right? But you've got these little gummy prisoners and they're chained to this wall. And here's another wall. And then people are carrying things behind the wall. And then behind them, there's a fire burning. Here's another view, right? Here's the fire burning and it's casting shadows, right? And so, of course, this is the allegory of the cake. I don't know, I just thought that was adorable. All right. Now, since forms are not perceived empirically, in other words, you don't see them, right? They cannot be learned through experience. We never experience the forms sensuously. We have never seen, nor could we ever see, a triangle. We see triangle representations, right? Things that approach triangularity, but not complete, perfect instantiations of triangularity. Yet we do know, but we do know them, right? We do know the forms. And lucky for us, we do, since the laws of geometry govern this world. So notice, the forms, remember, Plato argues the forms are what structures our world. It's what gives our world rational structure, and it orders it. So I'm referencing geometry here, right? You know, if you're trying to build a deck on the back of your house, it's a really good idea to know your geometry, right? And to know angles and all that sort of stuff, because it seems to govern the world. So that has a real practical value. But that's true of the other forms as well. The knowledge of cat form is what allows us to recognize cats when we see them, predict their behavior, etc. I think cat medicine requires a knowledge of cat form. So I know how to heal a cat when it's sick. I know how to recognize sick cats from healthy cats or whatnot. How am I going to do that? Because I have to know cat form, cat nature. So if we didn't learn the forms through experience, this is Plato's claim, how did we acquire knowledge of the forms? Plato reasons that we must have acquired knowledge of the forms somehow, sometime, before being born, since it was at no time after being born. So from our birth onward, we've only seen what we can see with our eyes, heard with our ears, etc., etc. And that isn't how you get knowledge of forms. So we must have gotten knowledge of forms sometime prior to all of that. Otherwise, we could never recognize the truth when we see it. In the Platonic dialogue, the Meno, Socrates teaches a slave boy geometry by merely asking him questions. And so this was a dialogue where Plato is trying to illustrate why he thinks it is sensible to think that knowledge of forms is sort of inborn, that we begin our life with knowledge of forms. This is supposed to illustrate that the boy knew the answers already. He merely needed to be asked the right questions in order to remember the truth that he already knows. This is the thinking behind the Socratic method of teaching. You've perhaps heard that phrase, the Socratic method. Well, the Socratic method is where the instructor doesn't just tell you. The Socratic method is where the instructor asks you questions. And by asking you the right questions, you come to understand on your own, and you come to your own appreciation of the truth. So what ends up happening is Socrates draws a square and then asks the slave boy, how would I double the area of this square? And he suggests, would doubling the length of the sides give me a square that had double the area of the original square? So let me set this up a little bit better. So here's a square. And now the question is, how can I construct another figure, which is also a square, but has double the area of the original square? How will I do that? Of course, the kid says, I have no idea. So Socrates says, well, what if I double the length of the sides? Would that give me a square that had double the area of the original square? And the kid goes, yeah, well, maybe. Okay. So let's imagine that. Here I'm doubling the length of the sides. And now I have a new square. Is this new square double the area of the original square? Well, the slave boy says, no, it's not double the area. It's too big. Very good. But let's draw a line from one corner of the original square to the opposite corner. Okay. Does that bisect the square into two even halves? Kid says yes. So now we have a square that's been divided into two equal halves. Is that true? Kid says, well, yes. Now, if we put four of those figures together, would we get a new square that was double the area of the original square? In other words, now we have, my graph is a little off here, wrong way. There. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 halves. Well, if we have 4 halves, is this square now double the area of the original square? And the kid goes, well, yes. Now you have a figure that is a square that is double the area of the original square. Socrates says, thank you very much. But notice Socrates was just asking the slave boy questions, right? Now, one initial rejection or objection to this illustration to say, yeah, but you were asking them leading questions. Yes and no. Notice he was asking questions which were helping that kid move in the right direction. So in that sense, they were leading. But the advance that each step required was the kid himself understanding, knowing what the right answer was, seeing what the right answer was. So the kid would not have been able to advance, even being asked those questions, if the kid did not himself understand or see. Right? So what Plato is pointing to is something that's referred to as the paradox of knowledge. So the paradox of knowledge says, look, either pursuing the truth is futile or it's unnecessary. And why is that? Well, either we don't know what the truth is, and therefore we can never recognize it, even when it's staring us right in the face, even when it's there. Or we do already know the truth, in which case there's no need to go and look. So the pursuit of truth is either futile, because we'll never recognize the truth, or unnecessary, because we already have the truth, so we don't need to pursue it. But Plato's solution to this is, wait a minute, we do know the truth, but we forgot. And so what we need is the world around us and good teachers to sort of jog our memory and help us remember the truths. So what Plato is suggesting here is that we already know all of the forms: cat form, dog form, triangle form, justice, beauty, goodness. We know them all, but we forgot them. Apparently, birth is so traumatic that we lose all of that knowledge. And so we spend the rest of our lives trying to recover the knowledge that we actually already have. And I think I say this in future slides, but I don't want to, just in case I don't. Notice, Plato is talking about recognizing the truth when we see it. And he's being quite literal about that. Recognizing. You can't recognize something unless you already know it, right? So, imagine you're at a party and there's that fellow across the room and he looks familiar and you go, he looks familiar to me. Oh, that's John. Oh, we went to high school together. Oh, you recognize him, right? And there's this immediate, oh, yes, right? Gestalt shift. Well, that is the kind of feeling that you have when you recognize the truth. Maybe you've had that experience where you're sitting in a geometry class and your geometry teacher, she's trying to explain to you, look, if the sides are equal, the angles have to be equal. You're going, yeah, right, whatever, I'll just memorize it. No, she says, don't memorize it. Don't you see? If the sides are equal, then the angles have to be whatever. And then flash of intuition, you go, oh, I see. If the sides are equal, the angles have to be equal, right? You have this moment of illumination, right? This epiphany. Well, that it feels like, and I literally mean feels, right? The phenomenology of it, the experience of it, is kind of like recognition, like recognizing an old friend from a long time ago. And you can't recognize something unless it's something with which you were already familiar. So all knowledge of the forms must be gained in some sort of existence before our life on Earth begins, Plato claims. Humans attain knowledge of the true forms or essences of the material world in this sort of prenatal existence. Right? This is called Plato's doctrine of reminiscence. This knowledge can be accessed after birth with the mental processes of recollection or reminiscence that is stimulated by being reminded. And how might we be reminded? By running into the copies we run into in this world, or being asked the right questions, or reflecting in our minds, right? Plato posited that our minds, or psyches, must predate our bodies, because this is the only way a human can gain knowledge of certain concepts like perfect equality, which cannot be gained through sensory experience. We never experience perfect equality. We never experience a perfect circle or a perfect triangle, etc. This is one of his arguments to establish the existence of an immaterial soul that pre-existed your body, right? Now, notice what he's not claiming here, right? Could you explain our gaining knowledge of forms by having lived a past life? So, well, you see, I'm right now a philosophy teacher at FIU, but in a past life, I was, I don't know, a king of England or something like that. Could I have learned about the forms when I was a king of England? Hopefully you just said no, according to Plato at least. And why couldn't I have learned about the forms when I was the king of England in my past life, if I had such a past life? Because I would be only gaining through sensory experience. I can't see the forms when I'm a king of England any better than I can see the forms now. So whether or not there are past lives, actually Plato's somewhat ambivalent on that, but whether or not you lived past lives as, Queen of Egypt or King of England or just a poor schlub in the Middle Ages or something like that, right? Whether you lived any past lives or not, that can't be the answer to the problem Plato is pointing out here. The problem Plato is pointing out is we have knowledge of the forms which does not seem to be based on any experience. It's not sensory. And so a sensory existence, like the one I have right now, cannot afford me this non-sensory knowledge of the forms. So I must have had an existence beyond this or other than this sensory existence, and that's why he thinks our minds or psyches must predate our bodies. Now notice, if our psyches can predate our bodies, then we have reason to think our psyches might post-date our bodies, right? It's like, you said to your last ex-significant other, I got along without you before, I can get along without you again, right? So if our psyches got along without our bodies before, our psyches might well get along without our bodies again. And so we have reason to think about surviving the death of our bodies. Now, is Plato's solution to this problem too spooky? Well, quoting Raphael Demos, he says, just a Plato scholar, he says, to some, the conception of a previous life with its opportunity for a glimpse of the eternal essences may appear fantastic. Yet, to anyone who believes that the soul survives the death, the view that the soul antecedes the body should not seem unreasonable. So he says, well, look, there's a lot of people who believe in an immortal soul that survives the death of the body. So suggesting that your immortal soul predated your body shouldn't seem so bizarre to, at least to those folks, because they already believe in an immaterial soul. In any case, the transcendental theory, this is Plato's theory, is only an interpretation of the immediate fact that experience fails to account for all knowledge. The doctrine of the limitation of empiricism remains, whatever one's view about the origin of abstract ideas may be. So the point Demos is making here is, all right, look, even if you don't like Plato's solution, the problem still needs to be dealt with. How do you explain knowledge which we have, which we rely on, which we depend upon, right? That doesn't seem to come to us through experience, right? That's what he's talking about, the limitation of empiricism, the limitations of what you can gain through sensory experience. We cannot derive our categories, thinghood, quality, relation, causality from experience because we use them in understanding experience. We cannot derive our laws of thought, such as the law of contradiction, from experience because they are presupposed in any actual process of thinking. And we cannot derive universal principles from experience because experience is limited to particular cases. So he's just pointing out that these abstract things like relation, causality, logical laws, universal claims, these cannot be supported on the basis of experience because they're either presupposed in experience or experience isn't sufficient to ground them. Finally, we cannot derive any concepts such as white square from experience because they constitute standards by which the data of experience are measured. The kernel of the Platonic theory is rationalism, namely that there is a non-empirical element in knowledge. So again, this is Raphael Demos. He was a Platonic scholar years ago. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was distantly related to Miriam Demos, who was a faculty member here at FIU. She passed away a number of years ago, but she was a classicist. Therefore, Plato believes that our consciousness, our soul, mind, or psyche, predates our body and will, in all likelihood, post-date our bodies as well. We, our souls, are immortal, like the forms themselves. The individual is identified with his or her mind, and not his or her body. All real knowledge is a matter of remembering the forms. So I'm just doing a sum up here. Right? Truth must be in us innately. Thus, Plato defends the claim that we have innate ideas. Indeed, his is perhaps the most robust notion of innate ideas. So that's a phrase I want you to be familiar with. Innate ideas, and innate ideas are what? They are ideas or mental content that is in us innately. It's inborn. It's not gained through experience. It's independent of experience. We might say a priori, independent of experience. Innate ideas, knowledge, and ideas already gained by the time of our birth. Now, again, Plato specifically is saying the infant cannot articulate triangularity form, of course, right? In fact, maybe the 20-something-year-old can't articulate triangularity form if they're not schooled. But the knowledge of triangle form is in even the infant, right? It just takes time, rational development, and the proper teaching to elicit, to pull out that knowledge, right? And so the teacher is sort of the midwife, right? The teacher is giving birth to what's already there, or helping the individual give birth to what they already have in them. Experience is useful only insofar as it jogs our memory of the forms, but it does not and cannot give us any real knowledge of ultimate reality. This makes Plato a rationalist, and I'll have more to say about that in future lectures. But the three main qualities that I want you to be aware of when it comes to rationalism, what makes a rationalist is, number one, they believe in innate ideas. Clearly he does. Number two, they are distrustful of the senses or sensory knowledge. They think that sensory knowledge, empirical knowledge, is an unreliable way of coming to know truth. And for Plato, it's absolutely useless in coming to know ultimate truth. Maybe it jogs our memory a little bit, but it's not giving us knowledge. And number three, the most reliable knowledge we can get is knowledge we gain through introspection, which is a priori independent of experience. So a rationalist is one who believes that the senses are a poor or unreliable source of knowledge, and that true knowledge comes through introspection, and there exists innate ideas. Now, this is contrasted, rationalist, is contrasted with an empiricist. An empiricist takes the opposite of each of those positions. Empiricists deny there's any real innate knowledge. They claim that the senses are a reliable form of coming to know knowledge, and they claim that really the senses are the only way of coming to know genuine knowledge. So the empiricists deny each of those points. Note further that Plato is sort of a mystic because he thinks that real and ultimate knowledge is imparted to human beings by means of a supernatural, extraordinary experience that predates our natural existence as biological beings here on Earth. So real knowledge is given to us, but not through the plodding through our lives as biological beings, but in this prenatal, mystical way. So notice there's an affinity here with certain religious traditions on Plato. Knowledge and education. So a couple of things. Something I think maybe I've had in the header at the top, but just to make clear. So we've moved beyond merely Plato's metaphysics, and now we've looked at his epistemology, right? What is the nature of knowledge? Where do we gain truth? How do we gain truth? Given his view of knowledge, what does he think about education? He says education is best served by asking the student questions and allowing the student to see the truth on one's own, right? This is the Socratic method. Real knowledge is conceptual and verbalizable. That which does not yield words, cannot be expressed in words, does not merit the title knowledge or wisdom or intelligence. So notice there's a sort of verbal bias here. Well, bias is maybe the wrong word, but certainly a slant here in Plato. What he's looking for is the ability to articulate in words your understanding. Right? This is something that Socrates was constantly doing as he was going around in Athens and talking with all the prominent Athenians, is discussing, dialoguing, and trying to articulate ideas verbally. The successful conclusion of a philosophical argument will yield the correct definition of the concept under discussion, the intellectual articulation and expression of the form, what it is that all and only courageous acts have in common, by virtue of which they are courageous acts. So what Plato seems to be suggesting here is that if I cannot verbalize what the nature of courage is, then I don't really understand it yet, right? It's still in me. It's still that knowledge. I can get it out if you work with me, if I ask myself or you ask me the right questions or whatnot, right? But until I can express it verbally, I don't have a full self-conscious awareness of the knowledge that is in me innately. Now, in the Theaetetus, which is a different dialogue of Plato's, he suggests that inquiry should be directed at trying to find a single formula that applies to the many kinds of knowledge. And he acknowledges that there are different kinds of knowledge. Is there a single formula that applies to all of them in a common form? Plato presumes that there is such a single thing, a common form of knowledge, which should be capable of being defined. Plato rejects the notion that knowledge is simply true belief. He says in the Theaetetus, but if true belief and knowledge were the same, then the best of jurymen could never have a correct belief without knowledge. But now it appears that they must be two different things. What is he talking about here? Well, in other words, if I believe this guy is guilty, and it's true, he is guilty, then evidently I know it. But Plato goes, wait, that's too fast, right? It's not enough for you to believe it and for it to be true. There's something desperately important missing out of your formula. You have to have good reason to think that guy is guilty. If I asked you, well, why do you think he's guilty? And you said, oh, he's got that guilty look. Oh, those guilty, shifty eyes. I was looking at him on the stand and I could tell at a moment he's guilty. Well, that's not good reason. You might be right. He might be guilty. But since your belief is not based on good justification, then we wouldn't call it knowledge. What's the upshot of that? Then there's a difference between having a true belief and having knowledge. A jury may correctly believe that the accused is guilty, but if their belief is based on hearsay, we would say that they have true belief, but not knowledge. Now, in the Meno, Plato explores further the relationship between knowledge and true belief, which is there in the Meno is called opinion, right? True opinion or true belief. However, Plato probably would not have claimed that the jury could ever have knowledge in the truest sense when it comes to the guilt of the accused. In the Republic, Plato claims that sensible objects and events, like the commission of a crime, are stuck at the level of true opinion for metaphysical reasons. True reality is in the forms alone. So the only certain knowledge possible is knowledge of the forms, most particularly the form of the good. Since the realm of becoming is a shadow image of true reality, the relationship between the two realms, of course, was illustrated in his Allegory of the Cave. So what am I getting at here? I'm getting at this idea that knowledge of things in this world, like whether that guy is guilty, or whether that cat is sick, or whether Paris is the capital of France, it's never going to be as reliable as knowledge of the forms. 2 + 2 = 4, etc. Geometry. Interior angles of a triangle are 180 degrees. That knowledge of the forms as per se is timeless, eternal, and absolutely certain. What we call knowledge of the world of appearances, that guy's guilty. Well, if I have good justification for believing that he's guilty, we'll call that knowledge. But it's not knowledge in the real sense, right? Why? Because it's metaphysically stuck at the level of mere appearance. It's metaphysically stuck at the realm of becoming. And there is no real knowledge about the world of becoming, right? We can't get real knowledge of that. Real knowledge can only be gained of the forms themselves, because only those items are timeless and eternal. Thus, the object of knowledge for Plato is the forms. When the soul inclines to that region which is mingled with darkness, the world of becoming and passing away, it opines only. And its edge is blunted, and it shifts its opinions hither and thither, and again seems as if it lacked reason. So what he's saying is, look, when you're making up, you're trying to understand the world of our experience. Again, you're on a jury, and you might be convinced that he's guilty. Maybe you've got really good justification that he's guilty. In fact, maybe you're even convinced beyond a reasonable doubt he's guilty. Might you be wrong? Yes, that's the nature of the world we live in, right? We have very strong beliefs about our scientific theories, but might they be wrong? Even your most ardent scientist is going to say, yeah, right? It's based on experience, we might be wrong. But that's what Plato's talking about here, right? When we are talking about this world of becoming and passing away, the soul opines only. In other words, it just has opinion, or what we might say true belief or true opinion. He changes his terms from time to time here. In the Republic, Plato describes two classes of things, those that can be seen but not thought, and those that can be thought but not seen. We talked about this already in the previous lecture. In the visible world, shadows, reflections, as well as things of which they are shadows and reflections, plants and animals, are illuminated by the sun and known to us by sight. So these are things that can be seen. I can see that cat. I can see that shadow. I can see that dog. I can see that good act, right? Individuals, vision, and I've seen them individually. So that's the world in which we live. That's the world we see. That's the visible world. Again, that's the world of becoming. But of the invisible world, mathematical equations and proofs, as well as forms themselves, these are not illuminated by the sun. They're illuminated by the form of the good, according to Plato, and known to us in the fullest sense of knowledge by the intellect. So the intellect sees the forms as illuminated, according to Plato, by the form of the good. So he's arguing that there's a sort of metaphorical similarity to the way the sun and light in this world illuminates the objects of this world, and the form of the good, or the light of that world, informs or illuminates the objects of that world. There are two metaphysically distinct types of objects. Owing to their metaphysical nature of these objects, there are two types of knowing, each directed to its object. So since there are two different kinds of objects, the visible and the invisible, there's two different kinds of cognitions. But maybe knowing is an unfortunate word there. Let's say forms of cognition. So the forms of cognition we use to deal with the visible world are different than the forms of cognition we use to deal with the invisible world. So already we have at least two different kinds of cognition. Those cognitions, those ways of knowing, if you want to call it that, cognizing, that deal with the visible, that metaphysical level of reality, and those ways of cognizing that deal with the invisible, that level of reality. These two modes of knowing or cognitions are unequal, and the former rising at most to true opinion, only the latter deserving the title knowledge. So those forms of cognition that are dealing with the objects of this world of becoming, even at their very greatest powers, they only rise to the level of true opinion. according to Plato. Genuine knowledge is only had by objects of the other realm using the cognitive faculties that are appropriate to those objects. So this is his view of what's called the divided line. This isn't the best slide on it. I'll leave it up for a second, but you can go back and look at it. I think I have a better slide here. Yes, I do. Okay. So here's the idea of the divided line. And this is the big line right here, right? Because on the left-hand side, we have the visible objects illuminated by the sun. And on the right-hand side, we have invisible objects illuminated by the form of the good. That which we see but cannot think, that which we think but cannot see. But these two sets of objects are further divided into, here we go, two subclasses, right? So of the visible objects, there are actual animals and trees and manufactured things and people and whatnot, right? So those are the actual objects. And then there's shadows or images or reflections, right? So me, I be here in this little box here. My reflection in a mirror would be in this box here. Me, I be in this box here. A photograph of me or a painting of me would be in this box here. So notice this is lower on the kind of rung of a metaphysical ladder, right? This is the lowest rung on the metaphysical ladder. Do these things exist? Yes. But how real are they? Well, they're less real than the next rung up. The next rung up is more real. Again, there couldn't be a painting of me if there wasn't a me. There couldn't be a reflection of me if there wasn't a me, but there could be a me without those things. So I'm more real than my reflection, and all of this is visible. Now, when we jump the line, now we're into the invisible world. But here, even the invisible objects divide into two categories, right? So there are sort of thought images. And I think what Plato had in mind is that the geometric forms are not strictly speaking visible, but they are kind of thought images, right? So we're not imaging the perfect triangle. We can't, because any triangle image we call up is going to be a particular, not a universal. But we are still articulating it kind of almost in a visual way. So genuinely speaking, they're not visible. They are gained through a form of cognition which we might call understanding, right? And they do constitute a genuine kind of knowledge. But the highest objects are the forms themselves, right? And of course, the form of goodness is the arch form. And this is the highest level of reasoning. And this is gained through dialectic thought, right? The exercise of reasoning. So this is his divided line, right? Where you have two main categories of things, the visible and the invisible. And given those two main categories of things, the visible and the visible breaks down into higher and lower visible objects, and the invisible objects break down to higher and lower. But each of these use a different sort of cognition. So again, these have been translated different ways, but we might call this conjecture. And conjecture is a kind of cognition which is only dealing with the lowest forms of reality. Belief or opinion, it deals with the next level up. Understanding is a third form of cognition, which is dealing with mathematical objects and geometric objects. And intellect or reason would be the highest form of cognition, and that's dealing with the objects of the highest forms of objects, which are the forms themselves. Okay, this is the same idea. It is important to realize that Plato believes these different objects of comprehension require corresponding epistemic states, corresponding forms of cognition. The faculties can't comprehend the wrong objects. You can't hear a painting, you can't see a song, synesthesia aside, okay? Therefore, faculties of comprehension and objects of comprehension are linked. In other words, opinion can only be the form of cognition that is linked at physical objects. That's it. You can't form opinions of the forms. That's just not the right, that's like trying to listen to a painting. It doesn't work that way, right? Likewise, you can only know the forms. You can't opine the forms. What Plato does is groundbreaking, strange, unique, potentially wrong, delete as appropriate, is to apply this logic to the mind. Because he thinks that knowledge refers to an object of comprehension, he also believes that there must be different faculties of comprehension. Put another way, he thinks that there are different types of knowing, again, perhaps cognition is a better word, that correspond to the different types of knowledge. But this implies that the object of comprehension can't be accessed by the wrong faculty. Why is this important? Because Plato is making it impossible, according to his system, for knowledge to be gained about anything other than the forms. Genuine knowledge can only be knowledge of the forms. Why? Because knowledge, the highest form of intellect, can only be directed at the forms themselves. Knowledge simply is knowledge of the forms. Can we know anything about the physical world? No, not in the highest form. The epistemic state for that is belief or opinion, right? Can we know anything about shadows? No. Again, the epistemic form or the cognition for that is conjecture or illusion. He uses different words. Brilliantly, this also works in reverse. Can we have mere opinions or illusions about the world of forms? No. Again, those are the wrong faculties. The only faculty we can use to comprehend the forms is intelligence or intellect, reason in the highest form. And thus, its product is true knowledge. The fundamental problem with the world of the senses is just that it is grasped by the senses, not the intellect or reason. Plato, in places, seems to allow that true opinion could become knowledge if it was tied down to an account of the reason why. This is later accepted as the traditional account of knowledge. So again, in the Timaeus, for instance, he seems to suggest that, well, there is a difference between true belief that the guy is guilty and knowledge that he's guilty. But that's if it's this qualified knowledge, right? We're going to use the word knowledge, but it's the closest we can get to knowledge when it comes to objects of this world. And so this is referred to as the traditional account of knowledge. This will be with us for a while, even after we leave Plato. In fact, it was with Western philosophy for a long time. It's still with us, right? Which is that knowledge equals true, justified belief. So that's the traditional account of knowledge. In order to say I know, it must be true, I must have a good reason for believing it, and of course I must believe it. But again, ultimate knowledge for Plato, that which is truly worthy of the name knowledge, will always be lodged in the world of the intellect or reason. When dealing with the realm of the empirically ephemeral, there's always room for error. Only when reason, forms, or logos itself is the object do we have knowledge. Do we have something that is worthy of the title knowledge? We already said knowledge and education. This is a repeat of the previous slide, but again, education is best served by asking questions. And as said before, the successful outcome of the dialectical project is to come up with correct definitions for the things under discussion. Now, ethical ramifications of Plato's metaphysical view. The attainment of knowledge of eternal forms is the only worthwhile activity for human beings. What is most real, lasting, and important about reality, that is, what is most of value, worthy of attention and service, is the immaterial realm. The most noble part of ourselves, our intellect, part of our soul, is satisfied by nothing less than the transcendent forms. So if you're saying, well, what is the ramifications for how we should live our lives? What should we value? How should we conduct ourselves? What Plato is saying is this search for the forms is the highest fulfillment of our nature. It's the use of our highest intellect directed at the objects of greatest metaphysical reality. greatest value, the most real, the most lasting, the most powerful, the most permanent. And of course, that's not lodged in the world of appearances. That's only in the realm of being. But notice what is most real, lasting, and important about the individual, again, what is most of value, worthy of attention and service, is that individual's immaterial aspect, the psyche or the immortal soul, is the only thing about you that could possibly survive the death of your physical body. So we want to take care of our souls, says Plato. I mean, sure, we can go to the gym, that's fine. But it's our soul that's going to, no matter how often I go to the gym, I haven't been going in a while, but no matter how often I go to the gym, this body's going to wear out eventually. It's not going to last forever. But our soul, says Plato, that's my chance at immortality. That's what we need to strengthen. That's what we need to take care of. Now, this sentiment would resonate well with later Christians who taught, quote, do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. From Matthew. So notice little Christians, when they would look at Plato, they go, hey, he was onto something, this Plato guy, right? He predates Christianity by centuries. But they go, oh, well, he was onto something. And of course, there were Neoplatonists in the first century Christian world as well. One of Plato's ethical slogans was, it is better to suffer an injustice than to do an injustice. Why is that? Well, it's better to suffer an injustice which does not jeopardize the welfare of one's immortal soul than to do an injustice which he thought did jeopardize the welfare of one's immortal soul. So if I suffer an injustice, my soul is fine. If I do an injustice, I'm actually injuring my soul, and that's worse. Now, of course, it would be nice, it would even be best of all, to neither do an injustice nor suffer an injustice. He's not recommending we go out and suffer injustices, but he's saying don't think that's the worst thing that could ever happen to you. Again, for Plato, to pursue wealth, physical pleasure, or worldly glory for their ephemeral charms is to be metaphysically misguided. The wise person, the philosopher, realizes that these are not to be sought to the detriment of one's soul. So again, this is the ethic that comes out of Plato's metaphysics and his epistemology. When we now some aesthetic verifications, right? Claims about beauty and ultimately claims about art. According to Plato, when we recognize something as beautiful, we do so because we recognize that it participates in the eternal form of beauty. Beauty, for Plato, names a transcendent object which does not exist in the world of the senses, but of which beautiful objects are mere imperfect copies. So notice for Plato, he is a realist about beauty and judgments of beauty. And if you and I disagree about whether or not something is beautiful or the degree of beauty it has, one of us, we can't both be right? Why? Well, because whether that object participates in beauty and the degree to which that object participates in beauty is an objective relationship between the object and the form of beauty. It has nothing to do with our subjective likes or dislikes. Either we're seeing things correctly or seeing things incorrectly, but the relationship exists regardless of how we might be seeing it. Further, whether or not an object I said the same thing now. Whether or not an object participates in the form of beauty is an objective relationship with no logically necessary consequence for perception. It follows that judgments about whether an object is beautiful or not are objective. Yes. They are not mere reports of subjective reactions, but rather claims about objective states of affairs. And they cannot be based solely on sensual appeal and are subject to revision and correction. So this is a view of beauty that is not widely held these days. It was widely held for a long time in Western thought. Plato's view on beauty was widely accepted, but contemporarily, I think it's very much in question. Nevertheless, recognizing beauty was something like recognizing truth, right? It seems to be a phenomenological revelation or an epiphany, an intuition, non-evidentially grounded certainty of an objective truth. So I think Plato is trying to speak to what it feels like to see something as beautiful. When you look out at a beautiful sunrise, or you see a beautiful, I'm partial to poinciana trees of late, and you see some absolutely stunningly beautiful poinciana tree, you go, oh, yes. You immediately are aware of a kind of truth, of an objective rightness. And it seems to be an immediate intuitive awareness or recognition. Go back to that. Right? And so what am I recognizing? Well, Plato says, oh, here's what you're recognizing. You're recognizing a form of beauty. You go, I know you. I know you, form of beauty. I knew you a long time ago, and now I'm seeing you again. So when we mustn't be too quick to discount this notion of intuitions, right? Because we use intuition all the time. I mean, remember in my lecture on logic and critical thinking, we talked about all A is B, all B is C, therefore, and you guys, gals and folks and people and whatnot, seem to know that the proper thing to follow from those two sentences was the sentence, all A is C. But if I asked you, how do you know? How do you know that if all A is B, all B, and all B is C, then it must be the case that all A is C? How do you know that? Well, presumably you're going to say, I just see it. But notice, what does that mean? I'm relying on a logical intuition. It doesn't seem to be inference. It's quite the opposite. Inference, logical reasoning, seems to depend on non-inferential intuition. Not that intuition depends on inferential reasoning. Logical intuition, right? There is a felt similarity between that and the judgment X is beautiful, or X is more beautiful than Y, and intuitively grasping some logical or mathematical truth, right? So again, when I sort of see, if you've had symbolic logic, perhaps you've constructed logical proofs, where all of a sudden you go, oh, I got it. I know how this is going to work. Right? Or in geometry, or perhaps in math. I've never had that experience in math. Again, the feeling is very similar to recognition and a kind of epiphany, right? Grasping. If now, moving on, another aesthetic ramification, if art is merely an imitation of nature, as Plato thought it was, in other words, Plato thought art was simply mimesis, it's simply imitating nature. Portraits are supposed to look like people, statues are supposed to look like horses or cats or dogs or whatnot. Stage plays are supposed to look like real life behaviors, etc., right? So art, for Plato, art was mimetic. It was imitating nature. But if that's true, then art is an imitation of an imitation. So notice a statue of a cat is an imitation of a cat, which is an imitation of cat form. So that's why that's a very low on the metaphysical rung, right? That's at the rung of appearance. Right? I mean, way down, illusion almost. Art for Plato had the metaphysical seriousness of shadows and mirror reflections. Now, since art also primarily appeals to our senses and not our reason, it makes it very low on the epistemological ladder as well. So Plato had a very low opinion of mimetic art. Metaphysically, it doesn't seem to be very real. Epistemologically, it seems to be incapable of providing us with anything useful. Since art directs our attention to the physical qualities of things and the physical in general, it is ethically dangerous, right? It's drawing our attention away from where our attention should be directed. Our attention should be directed at the invisible realm of being, and here now art is drawing our attention away from that. And since art appeals to our irrational emotions, prompting us sometimes to weep at play acting and the like, it is psychologically dangerous. I'll say a word or two about this in a moment, but he thought art has the potential of destabilizing us psychologically, stirring up emotions that we're trying to control. And that is harmful for the individual, and it's also harmful for society in general. If we have lots of these emotional individuals being stirred up by emotional art, this can be bad for society, right? Bad for the city-state itself. The wise person regulates the art that he or she allows into his or her life according to the directives of reason. This is what Plato would say. The wise polis, the wise city-state, the community, likewise regulates the art that it allows into the lives of the citizens. So just as a wise individual is going to carefully curate and censor what art it does or does not allow into their lives, likewise the wise city-state is going to carefully curate and censor what art it permits. Quoting from the Republic, Plato says, "The tragic poet is an imitator, and therefore, like all other imitators, is thrice removed from the throne of truth." I just like this. I think I'll just read it without much comment. There is an ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, of which there are many proofs, such as the saying of the yelping hound howling at her lord, or of one mighty in the vain talk of fools, or the mob of sages circumventing Zeus, or the subtle thinkers who are beggars after all. Notwithstanding this, let us assure our sweet friend and the sister arts of imitation that if she will only prove her title to exist in a well-ordered state, we shall be delighted to receive her. We are very conscious of her charms, but we may not on that account betray truth. So notice, Plato is a very good writer, right? And so notice when he says we're very conscious of her charms, that's a backward compliment, right? Because what he's saying is that's all art has to offer: charms, illusions, beguilement. And as long as it's not dangerous, but the potential is that it might be dangerous, might be psychologically dangerous, ethically dangerous, socially dangerous. You have to be very careful about that. If her defense fails, then my dear friend, like other persons who are enamored of something but put a restraint upon themselves when they think their desires opposed to their interests, so too must we, after the manner of lovers, give her up, though not without a struggle. So if art cannot defend itself as having a right to exist in a well-ordered state, then we need to give her up. When our interests are opposed to our desires, we must rein in our desires. So then, art is not a serious source of knowledge or wisdom, according to Plato. Some have suggested that Plato's work, The Republic, can be seen as making the case that philosophy, which is including science at this point, should replace art and the imaginative narratives as purveyors of knowledge. So again, this ancient quarrel that Plato is talking about is the quarrel between, let's say, the scientists and the artists, and who are giving us insight into reality and giving us genuine knowledge. At the time that Plato was writing, people were quoting Homer for knowledge of horsemanship and warcraft. He's saying, look, he's an imitator. Is he really going to be a source of knowledge? Plato actually recommended censoring parts of Homer, which would have been unthinkable to some of the people who heard that suggestion. Last little bit, Plato on psychology and the soul. Plato's starting point for his division of the psyche or the soul is the different classes he observes in society. He notes that people in society tend to live lives seeking satisfaction in one of three distinct ways. There are those who seek satisfaction by acquiring things, by manufacturing things, by modeling things, by acquiring things, by growing things, by reaping things. Then there are those who seek satisfaction by seeking honor and acquiring honor and respect and public acclaim. And there are those who seek satisfaction by pursuing wisdom, those who seek truth for its own sake, not necessarily for some practical reward, but to know truth because it's the truth, right? Philosophia. So these are three different ways people try to find satisfaction in life. He concludes that these natural separations must arise from the psychology of the individuals who make up society. Plato is noting here what motivates people. The object of desire distinguishes important differences among those desires. So some people are motivated by objects, some people are motivated by honor, and some people are motivated by truth. So some desires are directed at things, other desires are directed at reputation or honor, and others are directed at truth. But they correspond to three faculties of the soul: the appetitive, the competitive or spirited, and the rational. So these are aspects of the mind, of the soul, of the psyche, that are directed at these three different kinds of things. So the appetitive, appetite, is directed at things like food or sex or enjoyment, but things, and the enjoyment that things can bring. The spirited or the competitive is directed at honor and reputation, and the satisfaction that honor and reputation can bring. But the rational is directed at truth, and it's looking for the satisfaction that knowing the truth can bring, and only knowing the truth can bring. The psyche, he concluded, is divided into three parts. Each part concerns moving towards some object or motivation, and each differs from the other in terms of what motivates it. Reason desires truth and wisdom and is only satisfied with the highest things, forms. Spirit desires self-preservation and reputation and is satisfied by honor and acclaim. And appetite desires bodily satisfactions and is satisfied by the acquisition of things. Plato explains this tripartite division by an allegory, again, another allegory. This is the allegory of the charioteer driving two horses. The charioteer represents the rational part of the soul. The horse, one horse represents the spirited or competitive part of the soul, and the other horse represents the appetitive, the appetite, the desiring part of the soul. Now, the proper relationship, the healthy relationship, is to have reason in control of the horses. The charioteer is reining in the appetitive and the competitive. You can't get rid of them. Those are part of human nature, but you want to control them. There's nothing wrong with having desires. There's nothing wrong with seeking a reputation. But to seek your reputation at the detriment of your reason is self-destructive. Or to seek desires that are ultimately unhealthy is self-destructive. How do you avoid that self-destructive? You keep reason in control. Reason checks the excesses of the spirited or the excesses of the appetitive. And that's why you need the charioteer reining in. As long as the charioteer is in charge, you're going to go where you want to go. If you let your horses run free, you may end up in a ditch, you may end up over a cliff, you may end up in a very bad place. So that would be a sign of mental unhealth. Right? So remember a couple slides ago where we said Plato suggested that immoral behavior, acting unjustly, threatens the soul. Here's why. Because unjust actions would be allowing your desire to make decisions unchecked by reason, or your competitive nature to make choices, right? So that kind of life is the life of someone who's perhaps suffering from an addiction, right? Alcoholism or drug addiction. They're doing what they desire, but it's to their own detriment. And the desire is making all of the decisions. That's unhealthy. That's psychologically a bad way to be. So not only do you not want to be in that state, you don't want to do anything that might lead you to that state. How do you avoid that state where you are enslaved to your addictions or you're enslaved to your pursuit of a career? How do you avoid that? You keep reason in control. You act justly. So that's why it is better to suffer an injustice than to do an injustice, because doing an injustice potentially could damage your soul, your psychological well-being. I just thought that was cute, right? There's the charioteer and the two horses. I'll just make this point, right? The appetitive, the spirit, and then the rational. Well, if we look at Star Trek in the original series, we have Bones, right? Dr. McCoy, who always responds with emotion, right? Always responds, Jim, you just can't let them down there, right? Well, what do you want me to do about it, Bones? I don't know, but you just can't let it, right? Then Captain Kirk, I say he's the spirited. Why? What was his greatest concern? The Enterprise. The Enterprise, survival and the Enterprise. And then, of course, Spock would be the rational principle, logic, right? Now, of course, Plato would have made Spock the captain, not Kirk, right? But that would have probably been a rather boring series, right? Because each week you'd tune in and there'd be some crisis and Spock would do the rational thing and move on. And then the next week you'd tune in and there'd be some crisis and Spock would do the rational thing and they'd move on. But in keeping with Plato, though, notice when those three agreed on a plan of action, things generally went well. And when they were not harmonious, when they were not harmonized, things went poorly. Well, that certainly Plato would agree with, right? The harmonious relationship for Plato is reason in control of the other two, but you are seeking a harmony among the three impulses. Mental health was achieved by maintaining reason. Mental health was achieved and maintained when reason was in control of the other two motivators. The city-state was well ordered when reason was in control of the other two as well. So this gets into his politics. Right? The city was simply a macrocosm of the individual. Plato had argued that we want a form of government where reason is in control of the other motivating factors of society. So just as he thought the soul was divided into three parts, reason, the appetitive, and the competitive, he thought the broader society is divided into three classes. The rational individuals, who ultimately he would call the guardians, this is what he recommended. Then there's the merchants and the agricultural farmers that are good with things, they like things, they take satisfaction in things, and the military, right? The military forms, who are interested in honor and a claim that one gets from doing one's duty. Right? And so the well-harmonious state is when the philosopher king or queen, the rational, is in control of both the military aspect of the city-state and the mercantile. And those two individuals, but notice it wasn't a dictatorship, right? Because that could only happen as if the military recognized they were better off by listening to reason. So in a sense, they had to acknowledge that reason should be in control and allow reason to be in that control. Likewise, the merchants themselves had to realize that they were better off when the city-state is run by reason and the most rational. And so they have to voluntarily submit themselves to reason, right? Maybe not their own reason, but the reason of individuals that are even more rational than they. Right? So again, Plato wasn't arguing for a kind of dictatorship. Right? The guardian philosopher king, philosopher queen guardians, they only had the ability to reign if they were given that ability to reign by the people, right? By the merchants and the military. In Plato's Republic, people who are dominated by reason will become philosophers and eventually the rulers. People dominated by spirit will become warriors. People dominated by appetite will become merchants or manufacturers or workers or farmers. Reason should control the soul of the human individual. Rational people should control the Republic. In the Republic, bright women are given first-class education and are allowed to ascend to the level of philosopher, kings, queens, sovereigns. Right? Why? Plato was rather progressive here, right? He thought that there was no reason not to educate women. For goodness sakes, not educating women means we're cutting ourselves off from 50% of our intellectual capital. That doesn't make any sense at all, Plato would say. Right? That was not the common view, right? Plato was living at a time where women really weren't supposed to go outside the house if they were unescorted by a male relative. Right? It was still a very oppressive time for women in ancient Greece, particularly Athens. Right? Not Sparta, actually, but Athens, right? But Plato thought that was a mistake. He had women who were educated at his academy, right? And he had female students at his academy. Again, this was not typical of the day. We see then in Plato an attempt, now we're summing up. We see then in Plato an attempt to weave together in a systematic way the insights and resolve the concerns of philosophers who preceded him. From Parmenides and Pythagoras, we get the eternal and unchanging, and insistence that knowledge comes from the intellect rather than the senses. From Heraclitus, he retains the notion that the ceaselessly changing material world has some degree of reality and is not merely an illusion. But even Heraclitus mentions that this ceaseless changing is not chaotic, but rather regulated by logos. Heraclitus invokes the notion of logos to explain that this ceaseless changing is predictable and, in a sense, logical or principled. Like the pre-Socratics in general, Plato holds that the world is ultimately to be explained in terms of a single unifying principle, in his case, the form of the good. Like Socrates, he's interested in discovering the essences of things, wants to show how knowledge of them is possible, and links this knowledge with an understanding of the good and thus with ethics. The Allegory of the Cave presents in brief form most of Plato's major philosophical assumptions. His belief that the world is revealed to us by the senses is not the real world, but only an imperfect and ontologically inferior copy of it, and that the real world can only be apprehended intellectually. His idea that knowledge cannot be transferred from teacher to student, but rather that education consists in directing the students' minds towards what is real and important and allowing them to apprehend for themselves. His faith that the universe is ultimately good, his conviction that the enlightened individuals have an obligation to the rest of society, that the good of society must be one in which the truly wise, the philosopher king, are the rulers. One semester, after speaking with one of my students, after having given this lecture, I was trying to make the point that Plato's view of how we come to know forms is very different from what we might call common sense view that we might hold today. Whereas today, we might commonly say that we see a cat, then we see another cat, then we see another cat, and so on. And at some point, we create the concept of cat from our experiences. This, as we shall see, is more or less what John Locke believes. But Plato believes that this is entirely backward. So if the idea is that we create the concept of cat after our many experiences with cat by kind of constructing this notion in our head, that would be a view called conceptualism or nominalism. And this was a view of the philosopher John Locke. There are others, there are many today as well. But of course, Plato thinks that that idea of how we come up with the notion of cats is entirely backwards. In fact, to see a cat, as opposed to an absolute individual particular, unrelated to any other particular of our previous experience, requires that we begin with the concept of cat form, according to Plato. Thus, we cannot derive the cat form concept of cat from our experience. Our experience presupposes it. Notice that if we perceived each individual as an individual, they would have no common form. Indeed, they would have no determination whatsoever. As unique individuals, they are totally undifferentiated. The many would remain forever many to our experience. So this is the dilemma Plato's trying to solve. Maybe you don't like his solution, but get a grasp on the problem. The problem is that if each and every individual cat I simply saw as an individual cat, I'd never formed the concept of cat. And go, oh, there's one, look, oh, and there's a 2, and there's a 3, and there's a 4, and there's a 5, and they're all different because they're all individuals. So how do I get cat out of that? Right? What delineates one individual and thus serves to make them intelligible and thinkable are these forms, definitive natures it exhibits. These serve to distinguish it from previously experienced individuals and likens it to others. According to Plato, we cannot know the individual particular as an absolute particular, but only as an instantiation of some concept, form, or forms. Again, as an individual, they're meaningless. They only take on characteristics, salient characteristics, when we see them as instantiations of universal forms. So note, if I showed you a cat and then another cat and then another, and then I showed you a fourth cat that you've never seen before and asked you, what is this new particular? You would be quite correct to respond, I have no idea. I have never seen that before. And as an individual, you never have seen that individual before. You have never seen before. What you have seen before is cat form. So to see a cat as a cat, you need to see it as an instantiation, as a cat form. But how did you know what to see as relevant similarities with previously seen cats and what to see as irrelevant dissimilarities? You could not know which similarities to see as relevant and which differences to disregard as irrelevant if you did not already possess the notion of cat form. Again, this is if you believe Plato here. It is not clear that you could see any similarities at all, since you already had, unless you already had the ability to conceive of properties as universal forms. So in other words, unless you understood the concept of furry, you couldn't say, oh, they're both furry, because now you're applying an abstract concept, furry. And what is it that all and only furry things have in common, by virtue of which they are furry? Furriness. So you're applying furriness, which itself is a, so in other words, even to see the object as having any characteristics at all, you seem to be presupposing universals, forms. Thus, you could never come to see these various particulars in, as in the, let's try that again. Thus, you could never come to see any of these varied particulars as in any way the same. They're both furry. They both have blue eyes. Blue eyes, where'd that come from? Oh, universal. Eyes, universal. Blue, universal. All this to say, without knowing what cat form is, you could never see cats as cats. All you would see is a series of unrelated individual particulars. Further, these particulars would have no intelligible determinations. They would be undifferentiated being or undifferentiated particular existence. Certainly, this is not knowledge, and this would not allow us to navigate the world. The mystery to be solved is, where did our knowledge of cat form come from? Of course, Plato tells his spooky story about innate ideas. This is a story that Aristotle rejects in favor of something he takes to be more commonsensible. But as we shall see, he has, in my view, as hard, if not a harder time, explaining how this knowledge of forms arises in our understanding. That's preview of coming attractions. Just how crazy is the idea of many independent objective abstract realities? Oh, I'm sorry, that should say mind. How crazy is the idea of mind independent objective abstract realities? Well, perhaps not as much as you might at first assume. Three sorts of things give them every appearance of being abstract objects of the sort Plato is committed to. Entities existing outside time and space and outside the human mind. Universals, numbers, and propositions. Even today, there are certain mathematicians and philosophers of math who refer to themselves as Platonists, but they spell it with a lowercase p because they're not buying into the whole Platonist story. But they think that in order to make sense of math and mathematical entities, you have to hold that there are these mind-independent objective realities called numbers or numeric relations or sets or a number of others, right, at the fundamental level. And that concludes my lecture on Plato. Again, it occurs in two halves. This was the second half. And we'll be moving on to Aristotle next. So thank you for your attention. Till next time.